Last year, when our HOA president demolished our community basketball court and physically knocked me to the ground, I did something she never expected. I united 156 families to fight back, and we won. I'm James Wilson, corporate lawyer who specializes in property rights, and that battle was just the beginning. Because Karen Mitchell didn't just move away after we defeated her. She's been plotting her revenge, and now she's back with corporate millions behind her. Dad, they're tearing down the court again. My son's panicked voice jolted me awake at 3 a.m. this morning. I rushed to the window and saw construction equipment surrounding our beloved basketball court. The same court we fought so hard to save and renovate after Karen's first attempt to destroy it. You might remember my viral story, how one power-hungry HOA president tried to bulldoze our neighborhood's heart, how I uncovered her illegal actions, and how ordinary families stood shoulder to shoulder to protect our community. What you're about to see is what happened next, and the stakes are infinitely higher. After we ousted Karen, our community transformed. The basketball court renovation was just the beginning. We slashed those ridiculous HOA fees by 30%, built a community garden where Mrs. Patel now teaches kids about growing vegetables, and created the neighborhood we always wanted, one where families actually talk to each other. But last week, everything changed when a notification hit everyone's inbox. Oakwood residents, mandatory meeting, community acquisition notice. Some corporate developer called Metropolitan had quietly purchased adjacent land and was attempting a hostile takeover of our entire neighborhood through a legal loophole. Their legal representative, Karen Mitchell. They want to bulldoze everything. Mark told me, voice shaking as he forwarded internal documents a sympathetic city clerk had leaked him. The basketball court, the garden, half the homes, all becoming luxury condos. The architectural renderings showed our community completely unrecognizable. Sterile high-rises where family homes once stood. Membership-only amenities replacing our public spaces. Can they really force us out? Tyler asked, fear in his eyes. Should have said no immediately. But the truth caught in my throat. Karen had found our community's legal vulnerability and sold it to corporate developers with unlimited resources. They'd already started buying key properties and were just a few signatures away from triggering a hidden clause that would let them redevelop everything. The battle for our basketball court last year, that was just the warm-up game. Now we're playing for keeps. Our homes, our community, everything we'd built together was at stake. The community center buzzed with anxious energy as families poured in for the emergency meeting I'd called. Old rivalries were forgotten. The Garcias who fought with the Johnsons over fence height were now sitting together, whispering urgently. Even Mr. Winters, who rarely left his house, had wheeled himself to the front row. Is it true? Mrs. Patel grabbed my arm as I passed. They want to take our homes? The fear in her eyes mirrored what I'd seen across dozens of faces since the notice went out. Not without a fight, I assured her, though my confidence masked growing concern. The acquisition documents Mark had forwarded revealed a sophisticated legal strategy. I cleared my throat, and the room fell silent. By now, you've all received the notice from Metropolitan Development. I'll be direct. They've found a loophole in our original community covenant that potentially allows for redevelopment if they secure ownership of certain strategic properties. Projected behind me was the developer's master plan, a slick rendering of Oakwood Heights, a luxury condo complex where our homes currently stood. Gasps echoed through the room. They're offering buyouts to specific homeowners, corner, lots, properties near the entrance, and those surrounding community spaces. I pointed to a map highlighting the targeted homes in red. If they secure these properties, they can trigger a redevelopment clause written into our original covenant in 1978. That's absurd, someone shouted. They can't force us to sell. Legally, they can't, I confirmed. but they're offering well above market value to those specific homeowners. They only need 40% of those key properties to move forward. The implications sank in. We'd be fighting not just a corporation, but potentially our own neighbor's self-interest. "Where does Karen fit into this?" Mark asked, voicing what many were thinking. "She's their community acquisition specialist," I said, the irony not lost on anyone. "She knows our bylaws better than anyone, including which homes to target." The meeting dissolved into heated discussions. Some targeted homeowners admitted receiving offers significantly above market value. The Thompsons, whose home bordered the basketball court, had been offered nearly double what their house was worth. As people filed out later that evening, commitments to resist were strong, but I noticed worried glances exchanged between neighbors. Money talked, especially life-changing amounts. My phone rang at 5:30 a.m. the next morning. It was Mrs. Chen, voice trembling. "James, someone was taking pictures of my solar panels at dawn." When I confronted him, he claimed to be from the city inspector's office, but his car had Metropolitan Development logos. By noon, 5 more neighbors reported similar intimidation, spurious claims about code violations, property line disputes, and permit issues. The developer was creating pressure points, manufacturing problems only they could solve with their buyout offers. I spent days researching legal countermeasures while juggling my actual job and family life. Tyler found me asleep at my desk one morning, legal briefs scattered everywhere. "Dad, you need help," he said, setting down a coffee mug. My teenage son suddenly sounding like the adult. He was right. I called an emergency meeting with a smaller core group, Mark from the HOA board, Mrs. Patel, who had rallied the eastern section of the neighborhood, Richard Summers, our HOA attorney, and surprisingly, Mr. Winters, whose decades as a retired urban planner might provide insights. "They're moving faster than expected," I told the group assembled in my living room. "The Thompsons and Gregorys have accepted buyouts. Can you blame them?" Mrs. Patel sighed. "The Gregorys have medical bills from their daughter's treatment. That money would change their lives." The room fell silent. Our community's strength was being tested against individual needs. "We need to understand exactly what happens if they get their 40%, Richard said, flipping through the covenant. "The language is unusual. It's almost as if this redevelopment possibility was intentionally hidden in the original document." Mr. Winters cleared his throat. "Because it was." All eyes turned to him. "I wasn't the original planner for Oakwood, but I reviewed those documents years ago. This neighborhood was almost developed as commercial property in the 70s until community opposition stopped it. The developer concealed this clause as insurance." This revelation changed everything. "So our homes were built on a legal time bomb?" Mark asked. "One that Karen found and sold to Metropolitan," I added. We spent hours strategizing, eventually identifying 3 possible paths: legal challenge, fight the covenant's validity based on disclosure requirements; counter-organization, secure commitments from enough strategic homeowners to block the 40% threshold; regulatory intervention, petition the city to rezone our neighborhood, complicating the development plans. We divided responsibilities and got to work. I'd lead the legal front. Mrs. Patel would organize homeowner commitments. Mark would work with Mr. Winters on the regulatory angle. As we prepared to leave, Richard pulled me aside. "James, there's something else. Karen filed a personal lawsuit against you, claiming defamation and wrongful removal from HOA leadership. It's frivolous, but it's designed to drain my time and resources." I finished his thought. The strategy was clear: neutralize me while they picked off vulnerable homeowners one by one. Over the next 2 weeks, the pressure intensified. Metropolitan's tactics grew increasingly aggressive, from offering home inspections that always found critical issues to spreading rumors about property values plummeting once construction began nearby. Our counter-efforts saw mixed results. The city council seemed receptive to our rezoning petition until a metropolitan representative mentioned the significant tax revenue their luxury development would generate. Suddenly, meetings were postponed and calls went unreturned. Mrs. Patel organized a homeowner pledge campaign, securing commitments from many strategic property owners to refuse buyouts. But we lost the Jacksons when their daughter got accepted to an expensive college, the buyout solving their tuition concerns immediately. My own challenges mounted daily. Karen's lawsuit demanded extensive documentation of last year's HOA conflict. Metropolitan's lawyers filed complaints about our basketball court's lighting, our community garden's compliance with irrigation codes, anything to create leverage. They've got resources we can't match, Mark admitted during our third emergency committee meeting. They've hired 3 law firms. We have you and Richard working nights and weekends. I rubbed my temples, fatigue settling deep in my bones. We're at 27% of properties sold or under contract. They need 13% more. The doorbell interrupted us. Tyler answered, then appeared with an envelope. "It's for you, Dad." Hand-delivered. Inside was a personal letter from Karen, not a legal document or corporate offer. Her neat handwriting somehow more menacing than any legal threat. "James, this could be simpler. Metropolitan has authorized me to offer you a private arrangement. Your home purchased at triple market value, plus positions for you and Mark as community liaisons for the new development at substantial salaries. In return, you publicly support the project and end your opposition. Your family's future secured, and you'd still be helping shape the community. Consider what's truly best for your son. The offer expires Friday. KM." I stared at the letter, emotions warring inside me. The amount would pay for Tyler's college, set up his future, eliminate any financial worries we'd ever have. "What is it?" Mrs. Patel asked, noting my expression. I handed her the letter, watched her face fall as she read it. "Will you take it?" she asked quietly. Before I could answer, we heard commotion outside. Through the window, we saw several neighbors gathered at the basketball court, confronting men in Metropolitan Development polo shirts, measuring the space. "They can't do anything yet," Mark said. "They don't have the properties." "Unless they do," Mr. Winters said gravely. "Count again. Who sold today?" My phone buzzed with a neighborhood alert. The Patels' next-door neighbors, the Sandovals, had accepted a buyout offer that afternoon. With them, Metropolitan hit 38%, just one strategic property away from their threshold. As our group rushed outside to confront the surveyors, my phone rang again. Tyler's friend Jaden's father, whose home directly bordered the basketball court on the south side. "James, they just offered me 4 times market value plus relocation costs," he said, voice strained. "My wife lost her job last month. We can't say no to this, I'm sorry. With the Sandovals and now potentially the Millers, Metropolitan would cross their 40% threshold. The legal trigger would be pulled." I watched the children on the basketball court, oblivious to the corporate vultures measuring their future. Tyler caught my eye, concern evident even from a distance. Karen's offer burned in my pocket. Triple market value, financial security. All I had to do was stop fighting. That night, I couldn't sleep. Karen's offer letter sat on my desk, its promise of financial security for my family warring against everything I'd fought for. Triple market value. Enough to send Tyler to any college, to secure our future beyond any worry. I found myself calculating what we could do with that money, how it would transform our lives. Was I being selfish fighting this? Was I putting my ego above my son's future? At 3 a.m., I heard footsteps and looked up to find Tyler in my office doorway. "You're still up," he said, not a question, just thinking. I gestured vaguely at the papers scattered across my desk. He picked up Karen's letter, his eyes widening as he read the offer. "Whoa," That's a lot of money. It is. I watched his face carefully, wondering if I'd see desire, hope, permission to take the deal. Instead, he set the letter down with surprising gentleness. So this is like when they offered you guys the basketball court last year, except bigger. Something like that. Tyler sat on the edge of my desk. You know, Jaden's really upset. His parents are fighting about taking the buyout. His dad wants to, but his mom keeps saying they'd be betraying everyone. I winced, thinking of homes divided against themselves across our neighborhood. It's a hard choice. That kind of money changes lives. Would we move far? If you took it? The question hung in the air. I hadn't even considered where we'd go, just the money itself. I don't know, I admitted, but we'd find somewhere good. Tyler nodded slowly. Somewhere with a basketball court. My throat tightened. Definitely. Would it be like this, though? He gestured toward the window, where our court stood illuminated by the new lights we'd installed, with Mrs. Patel yelling at kids to stay hydrated, and Mr. Winters telling his stories about old basketball players nobody's heard of, and those community cookouts we do now on Fridays. Each question landed like a stone. The money could buy another house, another court. But not what we'd built here. My phone buzzed. A text from Mark. SOS. Metropolitan posted official notices on 12 homes claiming eminent domain proceeding rights under the covenant clause. People panicking. Emergency meeting called for tomorrow, 7 a.m. That wasn't legally possible yet. They were still short of their 40% threshold unless Jaden's family had actually signed. This was intimidation, pure and simple. As I stared at my phone, another notification appeared, an email from Metropolitan Development with a single attachment. The purchase agreement for the Miller property, Jaden's home, signed and notarized 2 hours ago. They had their 40%. Dad? Tyler's voice seemed distant. What's wrong? Before I could answer, a cacophony of notifications erupted from my phone. The neighborhood group chat exploding with panicked messages about the notices, people asking what to do if they had to leave their homes. They hit 40%, didn't they? Tyler asked, understanding immediately. I nodded, numb. And they're already acting like they own everything. My son's face hardened with a resolve I'd never seen before. So what are we going to do about it? I don't know if there's anything we can do now, I admitted, the weight of defeat crushing down. The covenant gives them redevelopment rights once they hit that threshold. You're a lawyer, Tyler insisted. There has to be something. I've looked at everything, Tyler. We fought, but so that's it? We just give up? Take Karen's money and run? His words stung, but the truth in them stung more. I was contemplating exactly that. A knock at the front door startled us both. At nearly 4 a.m., it couldn't be good news. I opened the door to find Mrs. Patel, still in her nightgown with a coat hastily thrown over it. Behind her stood Mark, Mr. Winters in his wheelchair, and at least a dozen other neighbors in various states of nightwear. They're at the basketball court, Mrs. Patel said, voice shaking, right now, with bulldozers. I pushed past them to see for myself. In the distance, the court's lights illuminated a horrifying scene. Construction equipment surrounding our beloved community space. Workers setting up barriers, a Metropolitan Development banner already hung. Karen stood supervising, her blonde hair unmistakable even at this distance. They can't do this, I said. Even with 40%, there's a process, permits. They filed emergency permits claiming the court is unsafe, Mark explained. They're demolishing it now to protect the community. The symbolism wasn't subtle. They were destroying the very thing that had united us against Karen before, making their first move in the dead of night when resistance would be minimal. Dad, Tyler said quietly beside me. Remember what you always say about bullies? They only win when you stop fighting. I looked from my son to the neighbors gathered on my lawn, their faces a mixture of fear, anger, and something else. Expectation. They were looking to me. I pulled out Karen's offer letter and tore it in half. "Get everyone," I said. "Now." Word spread like wildfire through our neighborhood. As I raced toward the basketball court with Tyler, Mark, and Mrs. Patel, I was already making calls. To Richard, our attorney, to local media contacts I'd cultivated during our previous HOA battle, to a sympathetic city council member who'd been helping with our rezoning petition. When we arrived at the court, the scene was surreal. Floodlights mounted on construction equipment cast harsh shadows across our community space. Workers in Metropolitan Development vests were erecting barriers while others prepared demolition equipment. And supervising it all, clipboard in hand, stood Karen Mitchell, looking exactly as she had a year ago when she tried to tear down this same court. But this time was different. This time she had corporate backing, permits, and legal leverage. This time she also had an audience. Neighbors poured from their homes, gathering at the edge of the court, some still in pajamas, others hastily dressed, but all united by disbelief and outrage. Children clutched basketballs, elderly residents leaned. On canes, families stood together in stunned silence. Karen's smile when she spotted me was pure satisfaction. "Right on time, James. I hoped you'd make it for this historic moment." "You can't do this," I said, approaching the barrier. A private security guard stepped forward to block my path. "Actually, we can," Karen replied, waving a document. "Metropolitan officially triggered the redevelopment clause 2 hours ago. This court is now private property, and we've secured emergency permits to remove this safety hazard immediately." "Safety hazard?" Mrs. Patel erupted beside me. "This court was completely renovated last year." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Our inspectors found structural issues requiring immediate demolition, all perfectly documented." She checked her watch. "Now, if you'll excuse me, we have a schedule to maintain." She turned to the construction foreman. "Begin demolition." "Wait!" The cry came from behind us. We turned to see Mr. Winters wheeling himself forward, his ancient frame somehow commanding attention, despite his physical frailty. "You're making a terrible mistake, young lady." Karen sighed dramatically. "Mr. Winters, with all due respect to your age, this is happening whether you approve or not." "I'm not talking about my approval," he replied calmly. "I'm talking about the archaeological review." Karen blinked. "What archaeological review?" Mr. Winters smiled for the first time that night. "The mandatory archaeological review required before demolition of any structure built over a designated historical site." A murmur spread through the crowd. Karen's composure slipped momentarily. "This isn't a historical site. According to the County Historical Society, it is." Mr. Winters pulled documents from a portfolio in his lap. In 1892, this exact plot of land housed the meeting hall where the county's first integrated civil rights assembly was held. I filed for historical designation 3 weeks ago when Metropolitan first showed interest in our neighborhood. I stared at Mr. Winters in astonishment. The old urban planner had been 3 steps ahead of all of us. Karen snatched the papers, scanning them frantically. "This is absurd. This designation isn't finalized. Pending designation requires the same review process," Richard Summers said, pushing through the crowd to join us. "As Metropolitan's attorney, you should know that demolishing a site under historical review consideration carries penalties of up to $100,000 per day, plus immediate restoration requirements." The construction foreman lowered his radio, suddenly uncertain. "Ms. Mitchell, should we proceed?" Karen's face flushed with anger. "This is a delay tactic, nothing more." "Maybe," I agreed, "but it's a legal one, and your emergency permits don't override historical preservation statutes." Flashbulbs popped nearby. The local news crew I'd called had arrived, cameras already rolling. Karen's eyes darted between the media, the confused workers, and the growing crowd of residents. "Fine," she spat. "We'll postpone tonight's work. But this changes nothing. Metropolitan will begin home evacuations tomorrow for properties already purchased." As Karen retreated to her car and the construction crews began packing up, a spontaneous cheer erupted from the neighbors. Mr. Winters accepted backslaps and handshakes with dignified pleasure, but pulled me aside as the crowd celebrated. "This buys us 30 days at most," he whispered. "The historical review will ultimately fail. The documentation is thin. I needed time for us to implement our real plan." "What real plan?" I asked. His eyes twinkled. "The one I've been developing for 40 years. The next morning, Mr. Winters's dining room resembled a war room. Maps of Oakwood estates covered the walls, property records scattered across tables, and neighborhood zoning histories stacked in precarious piles. Our core group huddled around as the elderly planner revealed his discovery. "The redevelopment clause Metropolitan is using has a fatal flaw," he explained, pointing to the original community covenant. "It requires 40% of strategic properties. Yes, but it also stipulates that redevelopment must preserve the essential character of Oakwood estates as established by its founding principles." "What does that even mean?" Mark asked. "It means," Mr. Winters said with unmistakable delight, "that we need to prove what Oakwood's essential character was intended to be, and I have evidence that it was explicitly designed as affordable family housing with guaranteed community spaces." He produced yellowed documents, the original designer's manifesto for Oakwood estates, complete with philosophical statements about economic diversity and community resources. "Where did you get these?" I asked, amazed. "I worked with the original designer briefly in the 70s, Mr. Winters explained. "When Karen started making noise last year about the basketball court, I reached out to his family. His daughter found these in his archives." Richard examined the documents carefully. "This could work. If we can prove Metropolitan's luxury condos violate the essential character preservation requirement, the redevelopment clause becomes unenforceable." "We'd need a judge to agree," I cautioned. "That's where I come in," said a new voice from the doorway. We turned to see Judge Harriet Washington, recently retired from the county circuit court, and as it happened, Mr. Winters' neighbor. "Harriet has been advising me privately," Mr. Winters explained. "She can't represent us officially, but I know which legal arguments will resonate with my former colleagues," she finished, "and which judges might be sympathetic to community preservation over developer profits." For the first time in weeks, I felt genuine hope. We had a legal angle Metropolitan hadn't anticipated, insider guidance from a respected judge, and 30 days before the historical review concluded. What followed was an extraordinary community mobilization. We divided into specialized teams. The legal team, led by Richard and me, prepared court filings challenging Metropolitan's interpretation of the covenant. The research team, headed by Mr. Winters and Judge Washington, dug deeper into Oakwood's original design principles, gathering affidavits from original residents. The community preservation team, organized by Mrs. Patel, documented every aspect of current neighborhood life, from community events to mutual support networks, proving Oakwood's essential character was alive and thriving. The media team, surprisingly led by my son Tyler and his friends, created social media content highlighting our fight, generating public support and unwanted scrutiny for Metropolitan's tactics. Karen and Metropolitan fought back aggressively. They filed countersuits, pressured remaining homeowners with increasingly generous offers, and spread rumors about property values plummeting once their luxury development was built nearby. 2 weeks into our fight, disaster struck. The Miller family, Jaden's parents who had sold their strategic property, tried to back out of their sale after seeing our community's resistance. Metropolitan's response was swift and brutal. They sued the Millers for breach of contract, demanding either completion of the sale or $500,000 in damages, an impossible sum for the family. The message was clear. There would be no backing out for anyone who had sold. Our legal challenge hit another snag when we discovered Metropolitan had donated significantly to the re-election campaign of the judge assigned to our case. Richard immediately filed for reassignment, but the delay cost precious days. With just a week left before the historical review concluded, Karen made her boldest move yet. Metropolitan announced a community benefits package, promises of scholarships for neighborhood children, subsidized units for elderly residents, and preservation of a commemorative garden where the basketball court stood. The package was designed to splinter our unified resistance by appealing to different demographic groups. It almost worked. At our next community meeting, visible divisions appeared. Young families tempted by educational funds, elderly residents worried about finding affordable housing elsewhere. The solidarity we'd built began to fracture. That night, I found myself back at the basketball court, sitting alone on the bench we'd installed during last year's renovation. The court lights illuminated the space where generations of neighborhood kids had played, where our community had found its heart. Penny, for your thoughts? I looked up to find Mrs. Patel settling beside me, offering a thermos of chai. Just wondering if we're fighting a losing battle, I admitted. Metropolitan has endless resources, and they're picking us apart. She poured chai into 2 cups. You know what I learned growing up in Mumbai? In communities where people have little, they share everything. In places where people have much, they often share nothing. I sipped the spiced tea, waiting for her to continue. What makes Oakwood special isn't the houses or even this court, she said. It's that we found a way to share our lives. The developer is offering to preserve buildings, but not what makes us a community. As we talked, others appeared. Mark, Mr. Winters, Tyler, and Jaden, then more neighbors, drawn to the court as if by instinct. Soon, dozens of residents sat in an impromptu circle, sharing stories of what Oakwood meant to them. Mr. Winters described how the neighborhood had welcomed him after his wife died. The Garcia family recalled how neighbors had pooled resources to help after Mr. Garcia's accident left him unable to work. Mrs. Chen showed pictures of her garden before and after Mrs. Patel taught her companion planting techniques. That night changed everything. We weren't just fighting to keep property, we were defending a way of life. By morning, I had a new strategy. We've been playing their game, I told our core team, fighting on their terms, legal maneuvers, procedural delays. But Metropolitan has limitless resources for that battle. What's the alternative? Richard asked. We change the game entirely, I replied. We make this about more than just our neighborhood. The plan was audacious. We would hold a community day at the basketball court, inviting media, local officials, and neighboring communities threatened by similar development. We would demonstrate that Oakwood's fight wasn't isolated. It was part of a larger struggle for community preservation across the city. Metropolitan and Karen tried to stop us, filing for an injunction claiming we were trespassing on property they now partially controlled. The judge, newly assigned after our challenge, compromised. We could proceed if we confined activities to undisputed common areas. The day arrived with perfect weather and a turnout beyond our expectations. Over 500 people came, not just Oakwood residents but supporters from across the city. Local businesses donated food, bands played, children covered the sidewalks with chalk art depicting their vision of community. Most importantly, people told their stories. On a stage we'd set up at the edge of the basketball court, carefully positioned on undisputed property. One by one, residents shared what made Oakwood special. Not the real estate values or location, but the human connections. The media coverage was extensive. Local stations broadcast live, and a national news program sent a crew. Save Oakwood trended on social media. By day's end, our story had spread far beyond our neighborhood. Then came the moment we'd planned for. I took the stage, Tyler beside me, and presented our community's formal proposal. Oakwood residents would form a community land trust, purchasing back the properties Metropolitan had acquired at fair market value, preserving affordable housing and community spaces in perpetuity. We're not asking for charity, I told the cameras. We're offering a fair business solution that respects both property rights and community preservation. What Metropolitan hadn't anticipated was our financial backing. Behind the scenes, Judge Washington had connected us with 3 ethical development companies interested in supporting community land trusts as alternatives to gentrification. They'd agreed to underwrite our purchase offer, seeing Oakwood as a potential model for sustainable development. As applause erupted, I spotted Karen at the edge of the crowd, her face unreadable. Our eyes met briefly before she turned away, already on her phone, no doubt reporting to Metropolitan executives. Their answer came the next morning, delivered not by Karen but by Metropolitan's CEO himself, who requested a private meeting at my home. Prepared for another threat or sophisticated pressure tactic, I was stunned by his actual message. Metropolitan is prepared to accept your community land trust proposal, he said without preamble. Recent events have created complications for our development strategy. Those complications became clear as he continued. The public relations damage from fighting a sympathetic community had spooked investors. 2 city council members had called for reviews of all Metropolitan's permits citywide. A state senator had proposed legislation strengthening community rights against redevelopment. Most significantly, Metropolitan's largest financier, an investment firm with increasing focus on social responsibility, had expressed concerns about the negative publicity. We're prepared to sell back all acquired properties at our purchase price, the CEO continued. In return, we want acknowledgement that Metropolitan acted legally throughout this process and a joint press release announcing an amicable resolution. And, Karen, I asked, what about her role in all this? The CEO's expression hardened slightly. Ms. Mitchell no longer represents Metropolitan Development in any capacity. As he left, I stood on my porch watching his expensive car drive away, still processing what had happened. We'd won, not through legal maneuvers or procedural tricks, but by demonstrating the actual value of what we were fighting for. Tyler appeared beside me. Is it really over, Dad? I put my arm around his shoulders. The fight is. The work is just beginning. 6 months later, the basketball court buzzes with activity on a perfect spring evening. Our renovated court now includes murals depicting Oakwood's history, painted by neighborhood children under the guidance of Mrs. Chen, who discovered a talent for art after retirement. I'm grilling burgers for our monthly community dinner, a tradition that strengthened during our fight against Metropolitan. Tyler hands out drinks nearby, teasing Jaden about his last missed shot. Dad, Mrs. Patel needs more vegetarian options, Tyler calls out, deftly handling his role as unofficial community coordinator. At 16, he's grown not just in height, but in confidence since our battle. The experience showed him what determined people can accomplish together. The Oakwood Community Land Trust is now officially established, with 178 properties secured in permanent affordability protections. We purchased back all 43 homes Metropolitan had acquired, with favorable financing from our ethical developer partners. Each month, more families voluntarily join the trust, seeing the benefits of long-term community stability over speculative real estate profits. Mr. Winters holds court near the garden, teaching children about urban planning principles from his wheelchair. The historical designation for the basketball court didn't pass, but we secured landmark status for our community center instead. where we now hold classes, meetings, and cultural events. How does it feel to be a revolutionary? Mark asks, joining me at the grill, nodding toward a framed magazine article displayed in our new community pavilion. The headline reads, "The Neighborhood That Fought Back, How Oakwood Estates Created a New Model for Affordable Housing." Hardly revolutionary, I laugh. Just neighbors who discovered we're stronger together than apart. Our story has indeed spread. Delegations from 3 other communities threatened by similar development have visited to learn our strategies. We've created a toolkit for neighborhood organization, sharing the legal documents, community engagement approaches, and financing models that worked for us. As the sun sets, I spot a familiar blonde bob at the edge of our gathering. Karen stands awkwardly on the sidewalk, watching from a distance. After Metropolitan dismissed her, she moved to an apartment downtown. Rumors say she struggled to find similar work after the publicity. I make a decision, wave her over. Conversation falters as neighbors notice her approach. "Is there something I can help you with?" I ask, neither friendly nor hostile. "I just wanted to see it," she says quietly. "What you managed to save." For a moment, I glimpse something like regret in her eyes. Mrs. Patel appears at my side, surprising everyone by offering Karen a plate of food. "Community dinners are open to anyone," she says simply. Karen hesitates, then accepts the plate with a nod of thanks. I don't know if she'll stay, if reconciliation is possible or even appropriate. What I do know is that the community we've built is strong enough now to face any challenge, whether from corporate developers or former adversaries. As families gather under strings of lights surrounding our basketball court, I realize we've created something precious. Not just preserved homes or recreational spaces, but a living demonstration that ordinary people standing together can shape their own futures. Sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to let someone tear down what matters most.